Parsha this week, Ki-Teitze. It seems to jump around. It seems to go from topic to topic, and there doesn't seem to be any connection. It first talks to us about when we go out to war, and if there's a woman among the captives and someone in Israel desires that woman, well, now what? And then it talks about that, and then it goes over and talks about what happens if a family has what's called a stubborn and rebellious child, ben sorer umoreh. What do you do with a stubborn and rebellious child? Then it's going to talk about that. And then we move over and we're going to hear about what happens when I'm making or wearing clothes and I'm checking, is it wool, is it linen? I shouldn't combine wool and linen. And it's going to talk about that, and then somehow we find we're talking about a criminal who's been executed, and then how long can that criminal wait for burial? And now we're going to talk about that. And eventually we weave over to, if you build a house, make sure that you're putting a fence around the roof. The roof has a flat top, make sure you put a fence around. And it seems to just be, okay, we're just moving from topic to topic to topic, wondering, is there a thread of connectivity that's going on? Is there a message? Is it just do this, do this, do this? Is it a checklist? What is it that I'm hearing in the Parsha as it just seems to be moving from place to place? And fundamentally, when we look at the details, we start to understand something. We start to see that there is an underlying question to every single example that I've just raised. And it goes back to the name of the Parsha, Ki-Teitze, when you go out. And everything is being framed with that question. Who are you when you leave your house? Who are you when you go out? There's a mezuzah that we're told to put on the thresholds of our doors. And we know that when we actually cross, we see the mezuzah when we cross that threshold. And in the mezuzah is the Shema. And the Shema is our prayer that really, bottom line, says exactly what we all have in common. A statement about God and a statement about nation. It's concise, it's to the point, we put it in the mezuzah, it defines our doorways. And we know that it is also defining a boundary, because there's the world outside the mezuzah, and then we cross the threshold, and there's the world inside our homes, which has now been framed with the mezuzah. The world inside our homes is the one we create. The world outside our homes is the one we enter and the one we function in, and it really is a boundary of a threshold between the two. So the Torah is asking, well, what happens when you cross that threshold? What happens when you're moving from one to the other? So we go back and we look at the examples. And it says, when you go out to war, if there is someone who desires a woman who is among the captives, the enemy after the war. And then the Torah says, well, now there's a process, because who are you in this moment? You've just won the war. You're the victor. You're the one who has the power. And then the Torah says, yeah, but we're going to put restraints on it. And we're going to say, who are you in this moment? You aren't the victor. You do have the power. And so if you desire that woman, you're going to allow her to transform. You're going to allow her to change her identity. You're going to give her time. There's going to be a process she's going to engage with. It's going to be a transformative change of identity for her, and you're going to back away while she's going through that. It is immediately telling us this is about identity. It's about who you are and who she is, and that your desire does not define her identity. She will transform, and you back away to allow her to do that. And when we move on and we talk about the example of the stubborn and rebellious child, and the Torah tells us that if there is ben sorer umoreh, a stubborn and rebellious child, that the parents have to bring that child to the elders. They have to go through a process identifying this is a stubborn and rebellious child, and there's a whole formula that has to be said about the behavior of the child and how they're identifying. It's a legal thing, because once it happens, that child will be put to death. And we're shocked. And we cannot believe that that is in the Torah. And when we look at it and we follow through, and the Talmud tells us it never happened, it was never carried out, the parameters of it were so tight that you couldn't do it. It couldn't ever happen. And so, of course, we then say, then why is it there? if it can't ever happen. And what the Torah is telling us is be careful about identities. Because this wasn't about the child, this was about the parents labeling the child, legally labeling the child, legally branding the child, and then the Torah is telling us, and now you've changed their identity, and their life is as good as done. We have to be very careful about the identities of others. And parents are always very sensitive about the fact that children are forming their identities, and we're trying to figure out those boundaries that allow them to form their identities as we protect them without imposing. And then we move on to the next one, and it talks about shutnez. Shutnez is that prohibition that says that we can't weave together wool and linen. And it really is one of those things where we do still check in our garments about, are they woven with wool and linen? And there are certain department stores in Canada, here in Toronto, where I know that they will stock suits that have a little label inside saying it's been checked, because they're serving a community that is watching that kind of thing. And when we go back and say, well, how could identity be speaking to this? And in the ancient world, it's not even a question they would ask because it's so obvious. If I wear wool, I'm a shepherd. That's how I got the wool. If I wear linen, I'm a farmer. That's how I grew what I needed to get the linen. It's identifiers. If I mix wool and linen, I am now saying, I don't want you to know who I am. I'm not even sure who I am. I have confused identity. And so the Torah is saying, don't go there. Make sure you have clear identity. You can choose what you want to communicate, but don't communicate that you don't know. Therefore, I'm going to trigger it by saying wool, linen. Who are you? And so it really does go to identity. When it talks to us about the criminal, it says that if there is a criminal you've executed, and we only would execute murderers, if there is a criminal you've executed for the worst crime you can possibly imagine, then the Torah says, however, you take them and you bury them by sunset. Because the question of identity comes back to play. When are they no longer a criminal? When do I look at them and say, you're no longer defined by that horrific, horrendous, intended action that you did? And the Torah says there is such a time when that identity stops. And now they are human like everyone else. And we give them the dignity, the respect, the kavod, everything we would give everyone else. There is a time that that identity will stop. And then we move to the very mundane, the homeowner. When the Torah tells us when you buy a home, your identity changes. It's not your finances that changed. It's your identity that changed. Because now your property speaks to everything out there. It's private property now. You own it. And therefore, you are saying to others, this is mine, and I hope you respect that boundary. And at the same time, the Torah is saying, you respect their safety. You make sure that there are elements in your home that could pose dangers to the public. Well, now it is on you. You are now the guardian. You are not the homeowner financially. You, as being the homeowner, are the guardian. Fence things. Keep them safe. Don't anticipate that someone might do something foolish. Anticipate an accident really could happen. Now keep your eyes on that. You are the guardian. So when we are homeowners, we actually have changed our identities. And so the Torah tells us, ki tetzeh, when you leave your home, who are you? What is your identity? Back to that very important question. What of our Jewishness that we took into the world from the homes we created, what are we taking into the world when we cross that threshold? And when we come back from the world out, back into our homes that we're defining, what are we bringing back with us? Because not everything from our day out in the world should find its way into our homes. Not everything will speak to our Jewish hearts that we are nurturing in our homes. We want to make these choices and these decisions, and they happen when we cross the mezuzah, when that threshold is there and we're moving back and forth. The Parsha tells us that we will navigate two worlds of identity, one in our home, one in the world. It's fine when we separate our private lives from our public lives. And in fact, much of our Judaism tells us that certain things are private and should be private, and certain things are public and should be public. And we have to navigate and understand all of that without question. But it's not okay when we think that the values we use to define our homes don't need to follow us when we actually live our lives on the outside. The Torah is telling us, no, that part of it is not true. Ki tetzeh, when I leave, when I go out. Who am I when I go out? When I cross the threshold of the doorway and I enter the complexity of the world and its layers that it represents to me, I'm always going to be asking myself, because the Torah this week has taught us to ask ourselves, our identity, how it shifts, how it changes, how it defines, how the boundaries affect us. And ki tetzeh, always ask that question. Who am I when I go out? We're going to continue with our